Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our great privilege to be screening one of the big films of Italian cinema, Federico Fellini's La Strada. This was the winner of the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film in 1956 and played in theaters in New York for 3 years. It stars Anthony Quinn and Fellini's wife, Giulietta Masina. It's a role that really made her career in oh so many ways. It's a moving film. It's a film that departs from neo-realism and points toward the Fellini who will bloom in the following years. We'll be talking about that and many other things after today's screening. Joining us will be Professor Giancarlo Lombardi from the College of Staten Island, a noted expert on Italian cinema. Now, take to the road with La Strada. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I'll give you a minute or so. Actually, I can't do that, but you probably need a minute or so to recover from one of the strongest endings of any of the European films of the 1950s. It's a very, very strong and powerful experience. So while you're recovering a little bit, let me introduce who's our guest today. Joining us once again on City Cinematheque is a good friend and good colleague from the CUNY system, Professor Giancarlo Lombardi, who's professor both at the College of Staten Island and here at the Graduate Center, where he teaches in our Italian program, our film studies program, our French program, and our comparative literature program. Giancarlo gets around, and in fact, for on a number of occasions, he's not only taught more the breadth of Italian cinema here at CUNY and at the Graduate Center, but is specifically concentrated on the cinema of Federico Fellini and Michelangelo Antonioni. Welcome back to City Cinematheque.
Good to be back, Jerry. Always a pleasure to be here.
So this film is a key film in any number of ways. I mean, it's a much awarded film. It's a film that remains famous well over 50 years later, but it's a turning point both in Italian cinema, or really one of the markers of a turning point in Italian cinema, as well as being a turning point in Fellini's career. So let's start with it as the kind of this marker in the different paths that the different roads, if I can use that, that Italian cinema is going to take. So before this, the thing that has made the impact of Italian cinema in front of the world in the post-war period is what everybody knows is as neo-realism. Yeah. The great films of Rossellini, De Sica, the screenplays of Cesare Sabatini, Visconti's contribution, etc. This film lands, squarely in that context. But Fellini has worked within the movement of neo-realism. But this is not a neo-realist film.
Absolutely not, and it is a very debated issue. Where does La Strada fit? Because this is Fellini's fourth film, if we count Variety Lights. By that time, Fellini has made, Variety Lights, The White Chic, I Vitelloni has just come out. And when La Strada arrives, this is clearly not a neo-realist film. This is certainly what Marxist film critics in Italy think. And this is how, this is why the movie will be attacked even before its release. I mean,
even before its release?
Even before its release. This is a movie that has a long process of gestation, the choice of actors, the choice of producers. I mean, the movie goes from one producer to another. Eventually, De Laurentiis picks it up. He doesn't really want Giulietta Masina because Masina is so associated to these roles, where she's been extremely successful, but playing the prostitute.
Right.
Apparently, he wanted his wife, Silvana Mangano, from Bitter Rice, famous from Bitter Rice. And at one point, actually, Masina gets injured, and he tries to replace her. And doesn't manage because she's under contract. When the movie arrives, when the movie premieres at the Festival of Venice, it's playing against Visconti's Senso, which is perceived instead as a neo-realist film, even though it is really not.
It's a period piece.
Because it does fall within a certain type of cinematography that addresses the political aspects of society.
Okay.
I mean, it is a period piece, it is a realist piece, more than a neo-realist piece, but it's addressing the Risorgimento, and as such, it is looking at the history of Italy.
Okay.
This movie, instead, La Strada, is timeless and spaceless.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you know, there are markers. Rome is mentioned. We know what period we're in, roughly, but not really. You know, Zampano would say that he was born in his father's house. When she
Right.
asked
Where
him,
were you born?
Born in my father's house. So it is a film that resists the tenets of neorealism. It chooses very well-known stars, and it has the qualities of a fable,
Right.
of a morality play. It has three central characters that seem to be borrowed from the world of the Commedia dell'arte. So it doesn't really fit with the political tenets of a current that is there to show what's happening in Italy after the war.
And of course, you know, the irony of that, in one sense, in terms of a global reception, is that it allows the world to embrace the film.
Absolutely.
Because of the sense that, okay, we're not looking at Italy anymore. We're looking at some kind of parable that you know, could even be virtually biblical in some kind of way. This landscape is a landscape of the marginal, wherever the marginal may be in the world, and we're dealing with elemental forces here as opposed to historical forces.
Absolutely, and you don't have any of the things we know from the neorealist films. Although, you know, some critics have said, so let's look at, you know, resemblances between, for instance, Bicycle Thief and La Strada, you know, and you have, you know, this couple, this pairing at the center of the film. But, you know, and there's a picaresque element to La Strada that is common to some of the neorealist films. But certainly you don't have what we consider to be, you know, the tenets of neorealism. And you're right in saying that this is exactly, you know, what allows this movie to show a different type of Italian cinema. I mean, we are at the very beginning of a new Italian cinema.
Right.
You know, I mean, there are two types of Italian cinema that have really made it all over the world, and it is neorealism and then the moment of the politique des auteurs, you know, auteur cinema of the 60s, the Fellinis, the Antonionis, that become so important, especially in the 60s. And this is, you know, this is a pivotal moment in Fellini's career. I mean, you know, Fellini after this movie will have Il Bidone, which is a more international film than his previous ones, if only for the cast. And then Nights of Cabiria. And then, you know, but the 60s are at the door. And if you think about what happens in the 60s to Fellini, from La Dolce Vita on.
Right, absolutely.
And what happens to Italian cinema in 1960. I mean, in you know, the same year that you have La Dolce Vita, you also have Rocco and his brothers. And you have Pasolini starting to make films. So something completely shifts.
Absolutely the case.
And also, by that time, the rivalry between Fellini and Visconti dies down. Because to go back to what I was saying before, you know, so the two movies, Senso and La Strada, are pitted against one another, but neither one of them wins at Venice. Senso doesn't get anything. Fellini gets the Silver Lion, together with On the Waterfront and The Seven Samurai. I mean, think about the kind of stuff that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Year. But also Rear Window
Yeah.
is at Venice that year. So I mean,
Give me a time machine. I mean,
it's incredible. And you know, and when they proclaim the winners, the Visconti camp starts booing. And at the forefront of the booers, there's Franco Zeffirelli, who's, you know, Visconti's assistant and a really important director of the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely correct.
It's an incredible moment. You know, they two, Fellini and Visconti will start exchanging barbed wires for a while, but then they will come together later in their career when, you know, when Visconti will show The Stranger, will release The Stranger.
Right.
And at that point, Fellini will say, well, this is his best movie, which is kind of funny because The Stranger is one of his least remembered films.
Absolutely. Well, least remembered because least seen, because there were many
problems of distribution and
problems
everything.
of distribution, you know, etc. So let's go back to some of the aesthetic qualities of the film, because we've talked in many ways about what it's not, and therefore how it defeated, how shall I put it, some programmed responses that were in the culture at that particular moment. But it's also, by Fellini himself says that, you know, if you really want to understand what happens to me, you can go to La Strada, because it's like an early treasury chest of the Fellini-esque. I mean, an adjective that we come to, you know, embrace in the second half of the 20th century, and happily still remains with us as an operating adjective. So, what are these elements that we see in the film that become this kind of archive of Fellini-isms?
Absolutely. Well, you know, you have the early appearance of the circus and the clowns. That is, you know, I mean, if you think about the role that the circus and the parade that is associated to the circus then becomes in Fellini's cinematography. You know, you think about 8½, you think about the clowns, you think about Amarcord and many, many other films, Juliet of the Spirits. And you have the creation of a character such as Gelsomina, who is really possibly the most important character in Fellini's films of all times.
And why do you think that's the case? I mean, not that I'm disagreeing with you, but I think, you know, I think anybody who sees this film comes away, and whether they ever see her in any other film, it's one of she remains, you know.
But the funny thing is that when asked who Gelsomina was, Giulietta Masina always said, it is Federico. It is not me. There was actually an argument over what kind of woman Gelsomina was going to be, because Masina wanted her to be a Cinderella figure, whereas Federico Fellini wanted her to be a fighter. She's a little bit of both, as a result. But Masina,
there's a combination of the whimsical, the ethereal, and the earthy at the same time.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I like to think, and I think that, you know, the key to this film is in the cast of characters.
Absolutely.
And you have, on one side of the spectrum, you have the very earthbound Zampano.
Yeah.
And on the very other side, you have the aerial figure of Il Matto, of the fool, who's, you know, the complete opposite. You know, he walks, you know, he does a balancing act. We see him from the very beginning doing a balancing act on a thread. I mean, and she's right in the middle. She's right in the middle between these two men. These two men who represent a part of her, who have a part of her, and her loyalties are completely split. And you know, and if you want, you could also interpret the whole movie as a questioning of where she belongs within this split, and what her role is. And in that, you know, I mean, one of the most important sequences in the movie is the discussion that the conversation that Gelsomina and Il Matto have about
parable
her
of the
role.
pebble.
The parable of the pebble. The fact that we actually know it as a parable, that is, you know, 50 years later, we still think of that as a parable, 60 years later to be precise. It tells you the importance, you know. So what is the role that I play? She's questioning what is her role. And, you know, and he says, well, even this pebble has a function, plays a role, and so do you. This holding on to a pebble, Well, you know, I mean, Zampano is very much associated to the pebble because he's earthy,
Right.
just like the pebble. And at some levels, he can be imagined almost he's portrayed extremely negatively throughout most of the film. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he is a negative figure. I mean, if we think about it throughout the movie, yeah, if this is a movie about Gelsomina questioning what her role is, this is also very much a movie that marks a catharsis of Zampano. I mean, it is Zampano who remains alive at the end of the movie. It is the only character who goes from the very beginning to the end of the movie. And is the one character who's yes, he's extremely earthbound, but he also looks up to the sky at the very end of the movie. Again, you know, you were asking me about symbols and elements that make this a Fellini-esque film. The beach, the water, the sea, you know, that is very much Fellini.
It's not true that I met Fellini, but I was in Fellini's presence once, oh so many years ago. He came to promote Satyricon. He did a press tour.
Wow.
And as a student. And one of the things that deeply impressed me, I mean, first of all, he was in person as playful as the films are at every levels. I mean, he was kind of delightful, and he did not want to be pinned down, and he despised interpretation. But what was so very interesting, about that was his responses, which is he's not alone in filmmakers in that way, because again his investment was in the creation of the story and the image, and that he viewed all interpretation as inherently reductive, whereas he wanted to put into play the image into play in the service, if I could call the entire film a parable in its own way, and it's exactly that irreducibility which was for him the very value of his art, and that movement towards a poetic cinema that also, coming back to the point you were just making, that eschews easy judgments, that moves away from the categorizations typical of melodramatic linear plotting, and that moves into a much, much more open space, which he considers to be the circus space of his kinds of parables.
Yeah, and it's a movie that is extremely slippery. It defies interpretation. It defies a clear interpretation. I think that this is one of the reasons why the movie was so resisted by the type of Marxist intelligentsia that reigned in Italy at the time, that expected cinema to play a completely different role, an educational role that was much more critical of the establishment. Fellini always did a balancing act with authorities. He was considered very much a Catholic director, yet he resisted religion in his own way. Yet, compared to auteurs such as Rossellini, such as especially Antonioni, he was certainly much closer to the Vatican.
Right.
They thought that he was protected by the Vatican, yet Fellini had to fight a good amount. And certainly, there's a new book that just came out in Italy on the relationship between Fellini and the Christian Democrats.
Okay.
The correspondence between Fellini and Andreotti, the most important politician of the First Republic, has just been discussed in great detail by Andrea Minuz, an Italian scholar.
But this is a very interesting statement, whether people ever, if that volume is translated, people have to read it, but just the mere fact that there was this correspondence.
Absolutely.
That is, we're talking about a cinema that is truly of great weight within the culture. Everybody is looking to the cinema to be interpreting the culture. So it is not just what do we see this weekend, it is an object of national debate and importance in how we're representing ourselves, the Italy that is emerging out of the ruins of World War II.
Well, let me add here that the politician I just mentioned, Giulio Andreotti, is the politician who who said publicly that neo-realism was bad because it was about airing Italy's dirty laundry in public. So, you know, it's, he is the politician who best represents, in a way, the difficult relation between politics and cinema. Fellini refused to be political in his films.
Right.
It's interesting that in a very recent film that came out last year called Viva la Libertà, an Italian director, Roberto Andò, who worked with Fellini as his assistant in And the Ship Sails On, chooses a little bit, he puts, and this is a very political film about the current political situation in Italy. He has an insert of Fellini being interviewed by the newspaper, by the news, as he's going to complain to the government for the use of cinema in television.
Oh.
Because Fellini resisted the fact that films, when being screened on television, were interrupted by advertisements.
Right.
And Fellini, who refused to deal with politics, who talked to politicians in this case because he felt that they were really destroying his art and art in general, he's now used within a political film. And is used within a political film because Roberto Andò believes that with Fellini's death, a certain type of politics begins, a new type of Italian society begins. You know, because when Fellini dies, so many journalists start going after his body. You know, they want to photograph his body. They want to photograph, you know, what's happening in the hospital right before his death. You know, Fellini, who resisted so much.
Right.
And it's sort of like, you know, the beginning of a new phase in politics that has to do with in politics and in television, and at that point, you know,
well, it's
the 90s,
interesting.
Politics and television.
So there's a way in which the argument you're making that I'm not in any sense resisting is that there really is an age of Fellini.
Absolutely.
And that what we're seeing in La Strada is, you know, if everything before this, and I'm as great an admirer of I Vitelloni as I think anybody on the planet, but I Vitelloni fits into one body of work.
Yeah.
Okay, with some differences, and now with this really begins officially the era of Fellini, which then goes so far as in his later years when he's the imagination is still rich and working. He again bumps into the distribution problems because he's ahead of people, or he's going on paths that do not fit with how cinema has turned back and become more homogenized. Less interested in the cinema of auteurs, less interested in you know, the kinds of poetic experimentation that he sees as the primary role of cinema.
Yeah, it is sad to think that, you know, an important director such as Fellini, who will actually even make something for television, because Orchestra Rehearsal is made for television and is one of the most poetic and most important reflections on the situation in Italy during terrorism, during the years of terrorism, then, you know, just doesn't fit in the new system. And, you know, and it's, you know, in his late years, he can't get his films. He can't get to make the films he wants to make because no one wants to invest on him because there aren't enough revenues coming out of his films. And you know, and he feels completely exploited by an industry that doesn't, that vilifies his product in showing it in a way that he thinks is disruptive. On the other hand, let us not forget that one of his most important late films is a scathing critique of television. Right. Ginger and Fred. You know, I mean, and it is the last big, you know, Masina and Mastroianni moment. You know, and this is very much, you know, La Strada is still very much Fellini before Mastroianni.
Right, okay. It's Fellini now with his wife, Giulietta Massina, but before...
But before before the alter ego.
Right.
You know, because Giulietta Massina is not an alter ego for Fellini, although Gelsomina can be considered an alter ego for Fellini. And the whole world instead considers Gelsomina and Massina to be alter ego of one another. The real alter ego of Fellini instead becomes Mastroianni.
Okay.
Just in the way that, you know, now Tony Servillo is the alter ego of Paolo Sorrentino in The Great Beauty, which is very much considered an homage to Fellini.
To Fellini, and the coda to La Dolce Vita,
Absolutely.
50 years.
And not even just that, but also Roma.
Yeah,
Fellini, Roma. I mean, it's...
absolutely the case. Well, so we're going to have to end our dedication to the age of Fellini on that note, but I think it's a good place to do so. If you've enjoyed today's screening of La Strada, please join us again on City Cinematheque for other examples of international cinema. Also, if you've enjoyed today's screening, please visit the CUNY TV website. Visit www.cuny.tv. There you're going to find the schedule of City Cinematheque. You're going to find descriptions of the other programming on CUNY TV, and you're going to find ways in which you may join our e-list, or you may write to us because we have links so you can communicate your comments. And we're always waiting to see what you think of what we're doing here. So please visit www.cuny.tv. Giancarlo, always a pleasure to have you here. There's so much more we could say, but I think we opened the treasure chest and gave at least a peek of some of the jewels that constitute the Fellini's great work.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Great. And I want to thank you for joining us today for the film and for today's discussion. And please join us again here on City Cinematheque as we stroll through the archives of film history. But for now, it's goodbye.